In this series, I like to find writing advice from famous authors, read it, think about what it means and what we writers can learn from it. This ought to be a fun one because apparently Cormac McCarthy really hates giving writing advice and talking about writing. So, sure he'd be a big fan of the channel. But anyway, he is of course the author of a number of really successful books, a few of which I'm a really big fan of. I feel like I've learned quite a bit from reading his writing, but now I've found some tips as well, so I'll read those. Number 1, I want even for the worst of the characters grace under pressure, some slinking nobility. If you've read any of Cormac McCarthy's writing before, then it seems like villains are something that he puts a great deal of thought into. I'm thinking about Anton Chigurh from No Country for Old Men or the Judge from Blood Meridian. There's definitely some slinking nobility and some grace under pressure with those characters, and I think those are two attributes that we could definitely apply to our own villains as a general rule. The danger with villains, I think, is that they just come to represent all that's evil in the world that you've created, or everything that's opposite of your hero. And in doing that, sometimes we can make those characters a little bit flat and two-dimensional, make them into caricatures rather than feeling like real people. And it's something of a cliche now to talk about grey characters, or everyone having a mixture of light and dark to them, but it's true. That's how people really are. No hero is ever completely good, no villain is ever completely bad. Being somewhere on that scale, maybe tipped more one way towards the other, just makes for more realistic characters. Not to mention something like grace under pressure, when you think about it from a villain's perspective, it's going to make them feel really creepy. As I said before, McCarthy's characters definitely have an element of this, and it makes them feel more formidable and more real as a challenge to your hero or to your protagonist. In a good versus evil story, most of the time I'm sure you'll agree that good is going to prosper, and the reader or the viewer or whoever is going to know that good is going to prosper eventually. The issue is that when your characters don't have this grace under pressure or this slinking nobility, or when they don't feel like rounded characters, they also don't feel like any kind of competition. So all of the tension that you want to build up between that good and evil just disappears because you know that this person is just a cardboard cutout that your protagonist is just going to run straight through. So by allowing your villains to have more human attributes and things that we might perceive as good when applied to your hero, I think it just makes them more interesting, makes for a better story. I'm also a fan of giving villains positive attributes that your hero doesn't have. I think if you can make your readers consider where the moral compass of your character is pointing, then you're doing a pretty good job. They're invested. So yeah, I definitely agree with this point. Number 2, creative work is often driven by pain. There's a couple of ways of looking at this, I think. The first is in terms of like subject matter for stories. A lot of people draw on traumatic events and terrible things. I mean, there's a real trend for post-apocalyptic stuff in fiction in general across all media, and that's been like that now for a good few years. Stuff like that is always good story fodder, I suppose. The danger is, though, that people will rely on that for story instead of trying to create value and meaning and impact themselves through their writing and through the actual story. They just say, this story is about this, and expect the weight that that has in our real lives to translate immediately to the story. And that doesn't often work. You have to find some way of writing a story that works alongside that subject matter rather than just lying on top of it. Otherwise, the whole thing can feel a little bit inauthentic. The other way I think you could look at creative work is often driven by pain is through the creative process itself, through actual writing. I've heard a lot of people talk about writing is painful or writing is difficult, and that's absolutely the case. Whichever it was or whatever it was that McCarthy specifically had in mind when he made this quote, I think it pretty much applies either way, and you can take it however you want. Whatever your reading is, I would say make sure to balance that dark with some light sometimes, whether you are thinking about your own creative process or you're thinking about your own story. Sustained pain over a long period of time is only going to produce so much writing if you're talking about your creative process, and it's only going to keep your reader interested and keep a story going for so long if you're thinking about your story. Number 3, it may be that if you don't have something in the back of your head driving you nuts, you may not do anything. This, for me, feels like a why do you write question. And that's one that I struggle to answer myself, and I talk about fairly often on this channel. I think there's always something in the background pushing you to get a story down on paper or to pursue writing as a pursuit day in, day out. I don't always know what it is for me, but there definitely feels like there's something. It feels like that deep-rooted reason for writing comes from the same place as story ideas. Like, things can come through that to you, but you can't see through it. It's a mystery. However, I think as mysterious as it is, it's well worth sitting and thinking about, because you may very well be able to decipher what motivates you as a writer, and if you can do that, it's probably going to work really well in getting across your message with whatever you're writing. It's going to assist you in doing that. It's just like a compass. It gives you direction, it's something to follow, and it's constant. And maybe some days you really don't know what the force is that drives you to writing. You don't really know what the point is. I definitely feel like that sometimes. I don't know what drives me day to day to keep doing this. I don't know where the energy comes from. I don't know why I just won't give up on certain stories. I've no idea, but it comes from somewhere. Whether you understand it or you don't, I think it's useful to have. But if you can get an idea of it, or if you can spend some time thinking about it, getting as close as you can to that, I think is always a good idea. Number 4, I believe in periods, in capitals, in the occasional comma, and that's it. Controversial. A lot of people hate Cormac McCarthy's writing style because of this, because he doesn't use speech marks or exclamation points or, anything other than the things that he just listed. Personally, I don't really mind too much. I find that the parts where you'd miss it the most is stuff like dialogue, but he does dialogue fairly sparingly and pretty well, so you usually don't lose track of who's talking to each other, although there are definitely times where I do. I'm a minimalist kind of writer myself, but if I'm writing a novel, I put the actual punctuation that, in my opinion, the story needs into that for sure. However, when I'm writing microfiction, I don't use speech marks and other stuff like that. I just italicize dialogue. I don't know why. It just feels like it's neater in a 100-word story to do that. I feel like it looks more whole somehow, and it breaks up the story less. I don't know, can't really explain it, but in flash fiction I put all of my punctuation, everything goes into it. But there's a lot of stylistic choices like that in Cormac McCarthy's writing that I don't understand and that I am not a fan of. For example, in Blood Meridian and some of his other stories in this Border trilogy, which is like a Western cowboy type trilogy, there's large passages that are in Spanish, completely in Spanish and not translated. And while there's obviously nothing wrong with writing in the Spanish language, if you don't read Spanish or if you don't understand Spanish like me, you spend a lot of time putting things into Google Translate, and that doesn't half take you out of the moment in a book. Perhaps I'm just speaking from a place of privilege being an English speaker, but it feels to me as though that's a choice that he's making, and I don't often understand why that is. Also, I don't think it's a popular opinion that you don't need punctuation, that punctuation has no value or that it detracts from a story in any particular way. In terms of detracting from the story just by using basic punctuation, I don't really necessarily agree that that's a thing. In some very specific ways, I agree with dropping some punctuation from writing. Exclamation points, for example, I rarely use them. I don't like to see too many of them in stuff that I read, because they for some reason just take me out of the moment. I just can see the author behind them too much. However, I wouldn't apply that to the majority of punctuation. I think that's just there to facilitate us reading the story. It's to make it clearer, and clarity I think is always something good to aim for in your writing. So I don't necessarily agree with this piece of advice. However, if I'm writing a microfiction, I don't use speech marks. I don't know why. Number 5, the ugly fact is books are made out of books. A novel depends for its life on the novels that have been written. Yeah, I agree with this. I think books definitely are made of books. I think books are also made of music, and books are made of film and conversation you hear on the street. I've said it a lot of times on my channel by now. I'm sure you're sick of hearing it, but influences are what make your writing feel like you, and they're just things you soak up and you can't help but soak up. It's not like you can choose not to be influenced by something that you read and you love. It's just unavoidable. And I think some writers worry far too much about originality. They'll assess a story before they've even written it based on whether anybody's written anything similar. Is the setting similar? Is the plot similar? The thing is, if you had that final piece of writing done, that whole story crafted, you probably have a lot of different ways that it's totally different from anything anyone's ever written before. However, beforehand, going into it, all you're going to see is the things that are similar. There are no new stories in that respect. You can't create something totally original, or very few people can. I certainly can't. But I don't think we necessarily need to worry about that. Unless you're intentionally plagiarizing something, it's coincidence. I think being inspired by something and stealing something are just two totally separate things, and there's a line between them that no well-meaning author could ever cross without being aware of it. Separate authors could be given the same exact outline and write a totally different book. That's the difference, is what the author puts into it, the parts of themselves that they bring to the book. That's what makes it different, and you can't avoid doing that. Just like you can't avoid writing in your own voice. It just happens, it's a part of your process. I don't think it's likely that an author could take on another author's voice with such precision that it would be deemed plagiarism. You can be influenced as long as you're not stealing. And I think stealing is a choice, being influenced isn't. Number 6, I never had any doubts about my abilities. I knew I could write. I just had to figure out how to eat while doing this. Must be nice. I worry about both of these things. I worry about the quality of my writing and how I'm getting on and how I'm developing as a writer. I also worry about ever making a living from doing this or ever making any kind of income from writing. In my opinion, I think a bit of self-doubt is a healthy thing for a writer. Without it, you might become overconfident in your work. You might miss your own mistakes or become ignorant to them even when people raise them to you. I think believing in yourself is one thing, and believing you're fantastic is entirely another. I don't think there's anything wrong with assessing yourself and figuring out how you can do something better, how you can learn from mistakes you've made before, or just build on what you can already do well. I think to just assume that, the inherent ability to write is there, I don't need to worry about that, I think that's dangerous because, well, you're not watching it, anything could happen to it. Writers with a great amount of natural talent for writing, the advantage is that they have their desks set up for them when they come to write already. However, they still need to put the work into actually writing, to building on the talent that they do have and getting better at it. It doesn't mean that they are naturally great at it and immediately as good as they'll ever be. Writers that don't perceive themselves to have the same amount of innate talent will need to set up their desk and make sure everything's in line before they do the writing, but the hard work, I think, is the same, and it should be done by all parties, regardless of talent or perceived talent. Number 7, even if what you're working on doesn't go anywhere, it'll help you with the next thing you're doing. Make yourself available for something to happen, give it a shot. Definitely agree with this one. I think it's a really good point. Every word that you put down, you're one word closer to the kind of writer that you're dreaming of being. Everything that you put down, even if you then delete it, is still progress. Every second or minute that you put into writing, you are advancing and getting better. I've written quite a lot over the last 10 years. 7 novels, some short stories, flash fiction, and some of that I'm not that proud of, but I wouldn't actually change it. Everything I wrote, I learned something from, and I realised what not to do as well as what to do, and it was all valuable. All of that contributed to how I feel about my writing now, which is that overall I'm quite happy with the stuff I put out. Without all of those failed stories and those novels with no plot, I wouldn't have that. I'd still be trying to figure out all the different parts of storytelling. So I definitely think just writing over and over again is the best way to progress. And don't feel that if you get to the end of a story and it's not what you thought, that it was a waste of time. You're constantly leveling up, earning experience points with everything that you put down on the page. Number 8, if it doesn't concern life and death, it's not interesting. Is it possible in any way for a story not to be about life? I don't think that's even a thing that can exist as far as I'm concerned. Every story echoes human life in some way or another, in some strange fashion. I think that's just unavoidable. Death, on the other hand, I don't know if that has to be part of every single story. This kind of links back to what I was saying before about subject matter carrying your story for you. You don't have to have blood and guts and shooting and violence in all of your stories in order to make them exciting or interesting for a reader. Characters don't have to die. You don't have to write a battle scene. There doesn't have to be a final face-off. All of that stuff is optional. There are other ways to make an exciting story or an interesting story or a story that matters. So I agree with 50% of this advice. I don't think you can write anything that isn't about life. However, I don't think it has to be about death in order to be interesting, necessarily. Number 9, the best things just sort of come out of the blue. It's a subconscious process. You don't really know what you're doing most of the time. Absolutely. That I feel like is really honest advice, and that's a really honest way of talking about the creative process. Neil Gaiman's another person that talks about this really honestly. Who does know where stories come from? I definitely don't. I joke with my wife sometimes that there's a little man in my head that works on all this stuff in the background, and then he sends that story idea up one of those suction pipes like you see in old buildings, and it just arrives for me ready to write. And it does feel like that a lot of the time. It feels like a subconscious process that's had a lot of work put into it. By the time it arrives in your conscious mind, the origin of that is a total mystery to me. I've got no idea. I wish I did know, as probably all writers do, because being able to pull from that or to receive those ideas at will would be a great advantage, but it just doesn't work that way. You have to engage in things that inspire you in order to prompt the whole system, I suppose. All I can really do is keep reading and watching things and listening to music and doing stuff generally that helps with my inspiration, and hope that another idea comes out of the void. Allowing yourself to be in a position to receive an idea and be inspired, I think that's the only thing you can do while you're waiting, as frustrating as that is. As always, I hope this was useful. Thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.